that we are together again after such a beautiful, spirit-filled prayer and worship. We are happy to go into some of the explanations of the Word of God so that we are given the grace to relish and cherish the messages and inner meanings of the Word of God, because ultimately it is this understanding of the Word of God, relishing of the Word of God, which ultimately leads us to accepting Jesus Christ, who is the fulfillment of the revealed Word of God, which we find in the Old Testament. So therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, I on my part welcome you to this study session. And those of you who have been following the study session so far might remember that we have finished briefly trying to explain the first two books of the collection of Pentateuch. They are the book of Genesis and book of Exodus. So today we are expected to take up the third book in the collection of Pentateuch or Torah, and that is the book of Leviticus. So those of you who have the Bible in front of you, I would request you to keep the part of the book of Leviticus open before you, so that as we go through this book, it becomes easier for us to relate with what we are saying or which part of the Bible we are discussing. Now, coming to the book of Leviticus itself, I would like to begin by just stating one significance of or importance of the connection between the second book in Torah and the third book in Torah, or the second book in Pentateuch, which is Exodus, and the third book in Pentateuch, that is Leviticus. So I would like to draw your attention to the inner connection between these two books. What is the inner connection between these two books? You might remember how we concluded the class or study session yesterday. At the end of the session, we said the book of Exodus concludes by affirming the presence of God, the glory of God descending upon the people of Israel, thus ensuring them that the presence or the glory of God will always accompany them in their journey of their life, and particularly in the journey through the desert. So now the glory or the presence of God has descended upon the people of Israel. The next question now will be, how can they make the glory or the presence of God permanent amidst them? How can they ensure that the presence of God or the glory of God will not leave them and will always accompany them? So the third book of Leviticus, is in the sociological, cultural, and religious background of that time, giving us detailed rules and regulations. Mainly the rules and regulations given in this book are concerning two areas. One, the cultic dimension, and the other, the ritual and moral dimension. So what is one expected to do in the cultic dimension and in the ritual and moral dimension in order to make sure that the glory of God or the presence of God will continue to be with us? In order to make sure the glory of God will not depart from us, will always remain with us, what are we to do in the cultic area and in the moral and ritual areas? So that is the connection between the material in the book of Exodus and book of Leviticus. Having said that, as a word of introduction, let us come to some observations about the book of Leviticus in general. To begin with, we remind ourselves of the meaning of the title of the book of Leviticus. We had said earlier as well, the English title Leviticus comes from the Greek title of the book, which is Leviticus. So the English title Leviticus comes from the Greek title of the book, Leviticus. And in Greek language, the title Leviticus means concerning Levites or about Levites. So the book is speaking about Levites. All of us would know who are Levites? Levites basically are that priestly tribe from among whom the priests were chosen, and the Levites' main duty was to take care of the Ark of the Covenant and tent of meeting, or the services in the temple. So that is why Levitical tribe is known as the priestly tribe. So the book of Leviticus is mainly about the duties, the functions, the nature of the Levites. So therefore, the book gets its title Leviticus. It means concerning Levites or about the Levites. However, we may also remember that the Hebrew title of the book is not exactly the same. The Hebrew title of this book is Vayikra. Vayikra. If we have to write that in English letters, it would look like a W A double Y I Q R A. I repeat, W A double Y I Q R A. Vayikra. Now, what does that mean in Hebrew language? Vayikra. It simply means and he summoned, or and he called. And if we look at the book of Leviticus, that is how the book begins. The very first verse of the book says, the Lord announced, or the Lord summoned, or the Lord called. So Vayikra exactly means and he called, or and he summoned. So I just recall to you what we had said earlier as well, that Greek title highlights more about the content of the book or the theme of the book, whereas the Hebrew title, as according to the custom of the Hebrews, derives the title of a book from the very first word or very first verse of the book. So here also that tradition is continued. Now we come to the content or the theme or the messages in the book, the matter of this third book, Leviticus, just to get acquainted with what is to be expected in this book and what do we read in this book. Book of Leviticus consists of 27 chapters, which we know all, 27 chapters. These 27 chapters, for our convenience, in order to keep in our mind the content of the book in a more organized and simple form, these 27 chapters we can see as divided into 5 major parts. 27 chapters can be seen as divided into 5 major parts. So ultimately, the book of Leviticus, which has got 27 chapters, can be seen as composed of 5 important parts or 5 important units. Now, which are these five important units or 5 important parts? The first unit made up of chapters 1 to 7 of the book of Leviticus. Chapters 1 to 7 of the book of Leviticus make up the first unit. And what do we find in these 7 chapters, the first unit? As we look at the Bible, we will know it very clearly. These 7 chapters describe about the 5 important sacrifices in the Hebrew cultic system, Hebrew religious system. There are 5 important sacrifices, and this narration or a description of these 5 important sacrifices are found in the first 7 chapters. Which are those 5 important types of sacrifices? They are: 1, the so-called burnt offerings, and 2, the so-called grain offerings, and 3rd, the so-called well-being offerings, and 4th, the sin offering, and 5th, the offerings with restitution. So I repeat the 5 important types of sacrifices: the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, the well-being offerings, the sin offerings, offerings with restitution. What do these offerings indicate, and what are they basically? What are they basically? When we read the book of Leviticus, things will be very clear. Burnt offering means the entire animal which is offered as sacrifice is burnt up. Nothing is preserved. Everything is burnt up. That is the Holocaust offering or the burnt offering. Grain offering is an offering where the devotee comes to the temple, comes to the presence of God and offers the grains, the produce of the land, the flour, the oil, and so on, the vegetables and the produce of the land they offer. Well-being offering could be of animals, could be of the produce of the land. However, the well-being offering is a sacrifice offered with the intention of getting some favors from God, some well-being from God. So that is why it is called as well-being offering. Sin offering is an offering made or a sacrifice made to God in order to get forgiveness from sin. When one commits a sin, then one has to repair for the sin. One has to offer a sacrifice to get forgiveness of sin. And then there is this restitution offerings, or the offerings with the restitution. That is when one has inflicted some loss on some people. How to repair that loss? So you have to give an offering as a restitution. And when you read these chapters, things will be more clear. So 5 important offerings are described here. You might remember there is also another important type of sacrifice which will be present in the later traditions of Israel, and that is the incense offering. However, in this section, that is not clearly mentioned. These 5 important sacrifices are mentioned. So therefore, that makes up the first important unit or part of the book of Leviticus. The second important unit or the second important part is found in chapters 8 to 10. Chapters 8 to 10. And chapters 8 to 10, what do these chapters speak about? Kindly look at the Bible and we will see these chapters primarily deal with the rites of ordination. So it gives a narration or a description of the ancient rite of priestly ordination, how the priests were ordained. It also speaks about the inauguration of Aaron's priesthood. So far we have made so many references to the priesthood, Levitical priesthood, Aaron's priesthood. Here in this section of the book of Leviticus, we have got finally the inauguration of the Aaron's priesthood. And then this section also gives a narration, maybe a tragic narration, a sad incident of the sons of Aaron, that is Nadab and Abihu. We may remember chapter 10 of the book of Leviticus tells us about this sad event, that is Nadab and Abihu tried to offer unholy fire, that is unholy sacrifice before God, and for which God punished them. And how did they punish? When they offered unholy, unworthy sacrifice, it is said fire came down from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. So chapters 8 to 10, just to remember in brief, it speaks about the ordination rites. It speaks about the inauguration of the Aaronic priesthood, and it narrates the tragic incident of Nadab and Abihu, how they are punished by God because they offer unholy, unworthy sacrifice. And that brings us to the third part or the third unit of the book of Leviticus. And the third part or the third unit is found in book of Leviticus chapters 11 to 16. Book of Leviticus chapters 11 to 16. These chapters deal with the loss of impurities. What will make a person impure, and how can a person who is made impure can come back to purity? So the loss of impurity. What will make a person impure and how that person can be brought back to purity and so on. That is we find in details in this section consisting of chapters 11 to 16. And chapter 16 is a very special chapter which speaks about the rituals of the Day of Atonement. What is this Day of Atonement? We mentioned yesterday, just in brief to repeat once again. Day of Atonement is a day once a year, an annual day, which in which all the Israelites will gather together in the presence of God, and for all the sins of the people and of the priest, an atonement is made. Atonement is made by sacrificing animals And also, a goat is brought forward, and the priest lays his hands over the goat, symbolizing that the sins of the entire nation is laid over the goat, and then this lamb is sent to the desert, called as a lamb or a goat for assassin. So that is the rituals of the Day of Atonement. So that is described here. Chapters 11 to 16, a section on the laws regarding impurities, and a section which narrates about the ritual of the Day of Atonement. We come to the fourth unit or the fourth part of the book of Leviticus, and that is in the book of Leviticus, chapters 17 to 26. Chapters 17 to 26. Book of Leviticus, chapter 17 to 26, is often called the Code of Holiness, the Holiness Code. Why is this section called as the Code of Holiness or the Holiness Code? Because various instructions to maintain one's holiness is summarized or given in this section. I repeat, the different instructions to maintain the holiness of a believer is found or is given in this section of the book. Therefore, this section, chapter 17 to 26, is called as the Code of Holiness or the Holiness Code. And that brings us to the, of course, in this section, after the detailed description of how to maintain the holiness, chapter 26 of this section concludes that part by giving a detailed list of the consequences of obedience and disobedience. Of course, obedience and disobedience to God. Or we can also say the rewards and punishment of obedience and disobedience. And then we have got the chapter 27, the last chapter of the book of Leviticus. And this last chapter is often considered as an appendix or a conclusion of the book of Leviticus, an appendix or a conclusion of the book of Leviticus, in which there is the chapter is dealing with the various votive offerings, various vows that the people would make, various offerings that the people would make, and how that has to be fulfilled, and so on. So we call it as the section on the various votive offerings. So, my dear brothers and sisters, just to keep the entire book of Leviticus in our memory, try to keep in memory the content of the book of Leviticus, and in order to facilitate that storing in our memory the important content of the book of Leviticus, we find the book of Leviticus as composed of 5 important units or 5 important parts. Chapters 1 to 7, the first part, which speaks about or narrates about the 5 types of important sacrifices. Chapters 8 to 10, which speak about the ordination rites and inauguration of the Aaronic priesthood and the tragic incident of Nadab and Abihu. And chapters 11 to 16, which is dealing with the loss of impurities, and it also gives a description of the Day of Atonement. And chapter 17 to 26, which is called as the Code of Holiness or the Holiness Code, which gives various instructions as to how to maintain the required holiness by a believer. And that part is concluded by giving us a narration of the consequences of obedience and disobedience. And finally, chapter 27, which is considered as an appendix or a conclusion, which speaks about the different types of votive offerings. So just a help to keep in mind the content of the book of Leviticus. Having said that, thus summarized the content of the book of Leviticus, before we take up certain passages for clarification and explanation, I just want to bring to your attention the important theological themes of this book that is called the book of Leviticus. The important theological theme of the book of Leviticus. The most important, the fundamental, the basic theological theme or the message of the book of Leviticus is nothing but the holiness of God. We can say that is one concept, that one idea around which the entire book is formed, around which the entire book is composed. The central theme that the book wants to communicate is a theme about the holiness of God. And that is why a couple of times in the book of Leviticus, there is this mentioning, God declaring that my name is holy. Holy is my name. Just a couple of references I point out to you in case it helps you for later usage. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 3. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 3, where we read God declaring my holy name. And Leviticus chapter 20, verse 26. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 26. Once again, the Lord declaring, for I, the Lord, am holy. I, the Lord, am holy. Leviticus chapter 22, verse 32. Chapter 22, verse 32, where once again God says, my holy name. My holy name. There are other references as well. As we proceed with the class, we will make sometimes references to it. For the rest, when you read the book, you will note for yourself. So holiness is the key theme, the central theme of the book of Leviticus, around which everything else circulates. So we should remember the book of Leviticus does speak about a cultic system, a sacrificial system. A sacrificial system which we might find no more relevant. Sacrifices of blood and so on, we find them no more relevant for the New Testament people. But we must appreciate the relevance of these sacrifices for the Old Testament people. For the Old Testament people, these sacrifices are guaranteeing the holiness of God. And these are the sacrifices through which the believers can respond adequately to the holiness of God. So the sacrifices have this function of manifesting the holiness of God, and sacrifices also have a function of enabling a human being to respond adequately to the holiness of God. Of course, today we no more go by those kind of sacrifices, the reason for which we will speak a little later. Holiness of God, the central theme. Now, in the book of Leviticus, what is the important symbol of this holiness of God? What is the important symbol of the holiness of God which the book of Leviticus uses? The book of Leviticus uses fire as the important symbol of the holiness of God. Fire. So fire has got a purifying capacity, and for the sociological, cultural times in which the Old Testament was revealed or inspired, fire has a very, very unique role, importance. So fire is taken that symbolic value. It symbolizes the holiness of God. So that is why when you offer a sacrifice, fire comes down and consumes the sacrifice. In order, as if to say, God has consumed the sacrifice. Fire symbolizes a holy God. And similarly, when you approach God unworthily, as it happened with Nadab and Abihu, when you approach God unworthily, the fire comes down and consumes the unworthy people, because fire symbolizes the holiness of God. Going further from there, well, the book of Leviticus has this as the key theme, the holiness of God. And because God is a holy God, that is leading to another character or the nature of God, which we find very often in the Bible. And that is, God is a jealous God. God is a jealous God because God is a holy God. Now, when we call God as a jealous God, what does it mean? We don't understand the jealousy of God as a negative attribute. For when it is attributed to human being, we will find that jealousy is a negative quality. But when we speak of God as a jealous God, it is not that negative quality or negative attribute which we have in mind. Instead, the jealous God means a God who is a monotheistic God. A jealous God means a God who is a unique God, a God who does not permit any other small gods as his rivals. So this expression that God is a jealous God is another way of expressing a belief in monotheism, a believing one true God. A one true God who does not permit his believers or his people to worship other gods. Why he does not permit his believers or the people to worship other gods? Because other gods are no gods at all. They are pure human creations of human hands. They are no gods. They are only creatures. So this attitude of God, which we may call as intolerance, not tolerating the pagan worship, not tolerating the idolatry, not tolerating the existence of other gods, because as we said, they are not gods themselves. They are only creatures, creations of human hands. So that attitude of God. So I repeat, the monotheistic believe in one true God. That belief is expressed in the Bible as the jealousy of God, not a negative attribute or negative quality when it is attributed or associated with the human beings. So this jealous God also manifests himself because he is a holy God who is separated from everything that is unclean. And one of the greatest uncleanliness is the worshipping of idols, worshipping of false gods, or going into idolatry. Now, this holy God, what does a holy God demand from his believers, his people? I repeat the question. Book of Leviticus highlights about the holiness of God, and this holy God whom we believe in, what does he expect from the people who believe in him? Nothing but God expects the people also to be holy. And that is why in the book of Leviticus, repeatedly, we will find this expression, I, your God, am holy, so that you also shall be holy. A couple of references I give you. Take, for example, chapter 19, verse 2 of the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 2. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So that is a basic demand. Be holy as the Lord your God is holy. We will have to relate this with the very creation of human beings. We remember what we had explained and said when we studied or analyzed chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. I'm not going into that details once again. I just recall to you in the book of Genesis, when we spoke about the creation of human beings, we said human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. And among the various aspects of the image and likeness of God in which human beings are created, we had said one important aspect is God is a holy God. God is a separated God. So God, who is a holy God, created human beings in his image and likeness, which means God, a holy God, created human beings also to be holy. And that same theme is repeated here in the book of Leviticus, and God makes it very, very explicit. I, your God, I, the Lord your God, is holy, so you also shall be holy. So that is the expectation of a holy God from the believers, be holy. So therefore, all these ritual and cultic and moral regulations that we find in the book of Leviticus about impurity, about clean animals and unclean animals, all these rituals, cultic practices, moral regulations, and so on, about impurities, purities, cleanliness, uncleanliness, and so on. All those rules and regulations are to be seen in this perspective. That is how the Old Testament people understood how a believer can maintain one's holiness by observing the laws of purity, by observing the laws of rituals, by observing the laws of impurity, cleanliness, uncleanliness, and so on. And above all, by observing the laws of cultic practices. Of course, there will also come moral principles about which we will speak immediately afterwards. So, why I am saying this is, once when we read the book of Leviticus, there is a danger of we thinking, oh, all these are outdated rules and regulations. We no more practice most of them. A few of them, yes, still maintain their importance, hold their importance. But many of them, we don't more practice. So we might think, oh, they are all archaic, old time. They are no more relevant. Please don't go into that temptation of discarding them as irrelevant. Of course, for our present time, with the advantage of the New Testament revelation, many of these practices may look irrelevant for us. Some of them still are relevant. Some of them may not be relevant. But in the Old Testament time, when this revelation was originally given to the people, they had a very, very important relevance meaning. And what was it? That was how to ensure the required level of holiness from the part of human beings, because a holy God expects us to be holy, because we are created in the image and likeness of God. Image and likeness of God, an important aspect of it is his holiness. Now, these sacrifices, rituals, and ritual purity and cleanness and or uncleanness, they are not the only ways through which the holiness is ensured. That is very, very important to notice. Book of Leviticus, I repeat, does give a long list of sacrifices and ritual practices and cultic practices in order to ensure the holiness of the people of God. But they are not the only means through which holiness is ensured. Very importantly, I insist, very, very importantly, the book of Leviticus connects holiness with two other very basic principles of Christian faith and of the biblical faith. Two other things with which the holiness of God is very closely intertwined, very closely associated. And those two other principles or things are: one, principle of justice, and the other, the principle of love. So the book of Leviticus, on the first reading, may appear to be all taken up by the rituals, rules, regulations, and so on. But not so. The book of Leviticus gives very, very importance to these two basic values or principles of biblical faith and of our Christian faith. And they are the values of justice and values of love of the neighbor. So a holy God expects human beings to be holy. And how can human beings manifest their holiness or exercise their holiness? Or how can human beings live their holiness? Human beings can exercise their holiness, manifest their holiness, live their holiness when they are faithful to the principles of justice and to the demand of love of the neighbor. I point out one or two instances where these two principles are highlighted in the book of Leviticus. For example, I recall to you something that we had said already in the context of the book of Exodus, and that is the so-called lex talionis. Lex talionis. Now, the so-called lex talionis in the book of Leviticus, we find in the chapter 24, verses 18 to 21. Chapter 24, verses 18 to 21, the lex talionis, in case someone of you have forgotten, lex talionis means the law of retaliation. We call it as a law of retaliation because it is said life for life, tooth for tooth, and so on and so forth. We had said that about that earlier. And in that context, we had said the expression law of retaliation might look a little bit negative. But in the original context, when it was given, that was actually a law of generosity, a law of restraint, a law of self-control. Because in the original time, when this revelation was given, Israelites were living amidst cultures which promoted unbridled or uncontrolled revenge on other tribes, on other people. We will remember the example of the book of Genesis, chapter 4, where it speaks about Lamech. So an unbridled, uncontrolled revenge, retaliation against all other tribes, all other people was the principle of the time, was the rule of the time. In that social, cultural context where uncontrolled revenge, exaggerated revenge was allowed, here comes the Bible with its new insight, with its new revelation. God reveals to the people of Israel that your life, your relationship should not be guided by exaggerated revenge, uncontrolled revenge. Rather, your life should be guided by a law of equity, a law of justice. If you are harmed in one eye, you can retaliate or you can punish the person by harming him in one eye, not in two eyes. If you are harmed in one tooth, you can punish the person who has harmed you in one tooth only in one tooth, not more than that. So actually, though it appears to be a negative terminology, law of retaliation, law of revenge, actually it is a law of generosity, a law of justice, a law of equity, which already is showing the progress which the divine revelation wants to bring about, in the mindset of the people in a context of the social and religious and historical situation, cultural situation, where the rule of the day was exaggerated revenge, exaggerated retaliation. So God says, you can't claim to be holy unless you are a person of justice. So your holiness has to be manifested in your just deeds in your dealing with others. So that is very, very important, my dear brothers and sisters, even for us today. We need to ask this interrogative question to ourselves. Am I basically a man of justice or a person of justice? If I am not a person of justice, I cannot claim myself to be a believer of the Holy God, because the holiness of God necessarily demands justice from our part in our interpersonal relationships. The other aspect which the book of Leviticus necessarily relates with the holiness of God is the love of the neighbor. And if this law of justice was a surprising element in the context, in the given context of the cultural and social and religious situation, this law of neighbor is much more shocking. The law of the love of the neighbor is much more shocking, because that was a revelation which the people of that time could not even think of. Even the law of justice was something that they could not imagine, think of. So God is taking them forward with his revealed truth, revelation. And that is much more true with regard to the law of the love of the neighbor. God in the Old Testament very, very powerfully, clearly gives this law of the love of the neighbor. Take, for example, chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus, verse 18. The last part of the verse 18 clearly said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And from here, we know very clearly from where did Jesus get the answer when the Pharisee came and asked Jesus about which is the greatest commandment. So the law of the love your neighbor as yourself. Again, in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34, we read, you shall love the alien as yourself. So you see how surprising, how forward this teaching is. On the one hand, it is said, you shall love your neighbor. Neighbor in that context seems to be one who belongs to your own tribe or your own clan or your own relative circle. But the book of Leviticus goes a step forward and says, you shall love the alien as yourself. A stranger, a pagan. You may not agree with a pagan, with a stranger, with a foreigner, as far as that person's religious beliefs are concerned, about which Bible is very, very clear. You shall not have compromises. But that does not prevent you from loving that neighbor, loving that stranger, loving that alien. Something which the people of that time, with their cultural, sociological, religious background, could never imagine. So that is another added example how the inspired word of God is taking us forward in our understanding. So therefore, the holiness of God is to be primarily manifested in this practicing of law of justice and law of the love of the neighbor. Now, once again, we must not lose sight of the interconnection between these two laws. Law of justice. Sometimes a person may practice the law of justice blindly. without any mercy, any concern, any sensitivity for the other. So already the book of Leviticus is providing for that. The law of justice very, very important, but the law of justice should not be practiced blindly. Instead, law of justice should be tempered with the law of love, tempered with the law of mercy. We can't separate the two. One cannot say, well, I am a man of justice and I will do only the just things. No, a Christian becomes a complete person when law of justice and law of mercy or law of love are combined together, joined together. You might remember we said the same yesterday as well when we spoke about the self-revelation of God in the background of the book of Exodus chapter 34. A complete picture of God is only when we combine together God as a God of justice and God as a God of mercy. The same is applicable to human being as well, because not surprising, because we are created in the image and likeness of God. So if God is a God of justice, at the same time God of mercy, we also human beings have to be beings of justice and beings of mercy. So that is one important theme, the most important, the central theme which the book of Leviticus highlights. I spent some time on this, my dear brothers and sisters, because I want you to take up the book of Leviticus next time when you take up and read the book of Leviticus. Always keep in mind what the book of Leviticus ultimately wants to communicate to us is a conviction about the holiness of God and the various aspects related to it. Otherwise, if we don't keep that in mind, we might end up in this temptation of thinking that this book for us is irrelevant book because it speaks about most of the archaic or outdated rituals, rules and regulations and so on. So having said that, we come to a little bit of an explanation of the passage by passage of the book of Leviticus. Of course, we don't have to spend as much time as we had spent in the book of Exodus or in the book of Leviticus, because these chapters don't require so much of an explanation. However, we said the first 7 chapters, we take them together. The first 7 chapters speak about the 5 different types of sacrifices. And we had given a list of these 5 different types of sacrifice. We don't have to repeat. Now, when we read these 5 different sacrifices explained in the first 7 chapters, we can come to a conclusion regarding the different purposes of sacrifices. The different purposes of the sacrifices or different intentions, or we can also say the different effects or outcome of sacrifices. Though these types of sacrifices, as the animal sacrifices, grain sacrifices and so on, do not exist anymore in our religious practices, all the same, the effects of these sacrifices are still valid and relevant for us. I repeat, the sacrifices as they are narrated in this section of the book of Leviticus may not exist for us right now. But the effects, the fruits, the consequences of these, the results of these sacrifices, they are as valid for us today as they were in the Old Testament time. So therefore, we look at what are the important effects or fruits or consequences of these sacrifices. We consider them as 5 important effects. 1. The sacrifices of the ancient time did highlight the necessity of a total self-offering from the part of a believer. I repeat, the sacrifices of the Old Testament did highlight a total self-offering from the part of the believer. That is very clear, particularly in the burnt offering. Burnt offering, the Holocaust offering, which is also called as, we had said, refers to when a sacrificial animal is completely burnt up to God. The entire of it is given to God. That is a symbol, actually. A symbol as the a sacrificial animal is burned up and taken up to God completely and entirely, the sacrificial animal there stands for the believer who offers, or who is supposed to offer himself or herself. The believer is supposed to surrender oneself entirely into the hands of God, and symbolizing the total self-surrender. The burnt offering is offered. So every time we come to participate in the sacrifice of the New Testament, and we know quite well which is the sacrifice of the New Testament, we need to ask this question: does this participation in the sacrifice of the New Testament realize within me a total and complete self-surrender before God, a self-offering before God? And about the sacrifice of Jesus, that is what the Psalm and the letter to the Hebrews point out. Here I come to you, O Lord, you have prepared a body for me, and I offer myself entirely. Jesus offered himself entirely, body and soul. So a total self-surrender, a total self-gift, a total self-offering is one of the most important results or effects of sacrifices, which is made clear in the Old Testament. The second important effect or consequence or result of sacrifice, we call it as sacrifices are basically expiatory in nature. I repeat the word, sacrifices are basically expiatory in nature. In case my pronunciation is not clear enough to some of you, I just spell out the word expiatory. E-X-P-I-A-T-O-R-Y. Expiatory in nature. Now, what does it mean to say expiatory in nature? Most of you would know expiating from the sins. That is, in simple terms, removing the sins. So sacrifices have got this intention. Sacrifices have got this effect. Sacrifice remove the sins from us, or remove the sin from the offerer. In the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, the two sacrifices, the sin offerings and offerings with the restitution. These are two sacrifices which primarily highlight this expiatory nature of sacrifice. That this nature of sacrifices removing the sins, or saving the believer or the offerer from the sin. Well, we also know that is quite true and completely true with regard to the New Testament sacrifice of Jesus. One of the most important result or effect of the sacrifice of Jesus is it removes the sin from us. It cleanses us from our impurities, expiatory in nature. The third effect, or the third understanding, or the consequence, or the result of sacrifice, we say, is sacrifices are vicarious or substitutionary in nature. I repeat, sacrifices are vicarious or substitutionary in nature. V-I-C-A-R-I-O-U-S, vicarious in nature or substitutionary in nature. What does it mean? In simple terms, it means sacrifices are offered in place or for the sake of, or we say once again, on behalf of somebody else. Sacrifices are offered in place of, or on behalf of, or for the sake of somebody else. What does it mean? It means a sacrificial animal is offered to God where a human being supposed to have been offered. I clarified once again, because of our sins, because of our evil doing, we, the sinner, the evildoer, requires or needs to be sacrificed. But instead of we being punished, or instead of we being sacrificed, an animal is sacrificed. So the animal is a substitutionary in nature. Animal substitutes the sinner. Animal substitutes the believer. Or animal is vicarious in nature. You know the word meaning of vicar. Vicar is one who takes the pastoral care of a place in the name of bishop. That is the basic understanding. Bishop is supposed to be the person who is ultimately responsible for the pastoral care of the entire diocese. But since bishop as an individual cannot be present in all the places at the same time, in his name, he appoints priests as representatives of the bishops in the parishes. So priest becomes a vicar there because he is taking care of the pastoral needs of the particular community or parish in the name of the bishop or on behalf of the bishop. So that is the basic meaning of the word vicar, and that is the meaning with which we use that expression here in the context of sacrifices. A sacrificial animal has a vicarious nature. Sacrificial animal dies where actually the believer deserved to die because of the sins. And that is quite true about the sacrifice of Jesus Christ as well. We all believe and we are convinced Jesus died on our behalf. Jesus died instead of us. We, the sinners, deserve to die. But in order to save us from the deserving death, Jesus died on our behalf. So Jesus is, the sacrifice of Jesus is substitutionary in nature, vicarious in nature. And that idea of the sacrifice of Jesus is already hinted at in the sacrificial system as narrated in the book of Leviticus. We come to the fourth aspect or the fourth effect or the fourth result of the sacrifice. And that is sacrifices are thanksgiving in nature. Sacrifices are thanksgiving in nature. In other words, sacrifices are expressions of gratitude from the part of the believer. A believer, when he or she comes before God, is moved from within in order to thank God for all the blessings and graces and the favors that he or she has received. So sacrifices become an expression of one's inner gratitude, inner thanksgiving. So that is why sacrifices are thanksgiving in nature. And we all know quite well this is perfectly true regarding the New Testament sacrifice, the sacrifice of Jesus. Sacrifice of Jesus is thanksgiving in nature. And that is why the sacrifice of Jesus we call as Eucharist, Eucharistia. So the good graces, the good that is a sacrifice of thanksgiving. That's why we call it as the Eucharist, which means it's sacrifice of thanksgiving, and that is already hinted at, or the way is already prepared, anticipated in the book of Leviticus. And we speak about the fifth and the final result or the consequence or the effect of the sacrifice, and that is sacrifices are intercessory in nature. Or in other words, we say sacrifices have intercessory dimension. Intercessory dimension. In the book of Leviticus, the burnt offerings in particular highlight this intercessory dimension as well. What do we mean by the intercessory dimension? That which we understand in our normal language. Intercessory means sacrifices are offered to God so that through the sacrifices, a believer can intercede for favors from God. In order to receive greater blessings, in order to receive greater favors, some particular special intention, some particular need. So sacrifices are offered. Don't get scandalized if we say in order to please God, so that we can intercede for greater blessings or favors, either for ourselves or for others. So that is why sacrifices are intercessory in nature. They have an intercessory dimension. In the New Testament sacrifice of Jesus also, that is quite true. By participating in the sacrifice of Jesus, by participating in the Eucharist, we do hope to receive greater and greater blessings. And that is our actual experience as well. We plead God for greater favors. We intercede God by participating in the sacrifice for greater blessings and graces from God. So I conclude, my dear brothers and sisters, this particular discussion about the sacrifices. The book of Leviticus speak about 5 important sacrifices. I repeat, these 5 types of sacrifices, they may look to us as irrelevant anymore, not relevant anymore, but the message, the theme, the theological meaning of these 5 sacrifices are still relevant for us. And what are they? Sacrifices are expressions of total and complete self-giving. Sacrifices are expiatory in nature. Sacrifices are vicarious or substitutionary in nature. Sacrifices are thanksgiving in nature, and sacrifices have an intercessory mediation or intercessory role, intercessory nature. So that is with regard to the first 7 chapters, and each time when we participate in sacrifices, we would better appreciate our participation in the sacrifice if we remember that the sacrifice that we participate in are the fulfillment of these Old Testament sacrifices. We come to the next chapter, and that is chapter 8, which speaks about the next section, which speaks about the ordination rites. Um, uh, Ordination rites. Nothing much to say about that. You see how the priests are to be ordained, and after that, that ordination rites are actualized, concretized, and thus the Aaron's priesthood is inaugurated, which we find in chapter 9. And chapter 10, nothing much theologically to be explained there. It is a tragic incident of Nadab and Abihu. And we said, what is that tragic incident? Nadab and Abihu, who are ordained to be priests to offer sacrifice before God, they offered sacrifice, but an unworthy sacrifice. They offered unworthy fire, it is said. And when they offered unworthy fire, the fire came down from the altar and consumed them. Now we might ask what is meant by this unworthy fire or unworthy sacrifice they offered. Now this unworthiness in which they offered the sacrifice could be referring to various aspects. One, it could be a reference to the sacrificing objects they brought. We know there are clear indications regarding what type of things, what type of animals, what kind of birds, what kind of grain, what kind of oil, what kind of flour. So what kind of things to be brought before God. Maybe they violated certain prescriptions about the criteria or the qualities of this. Maybe they brought things that are unworthy. This unworthy sacrifice could also refer to their own internal disposition. We know a priest, according to the Old Testament laws, when a priest is presenting oneself before God, one has to present oneself with certain dispositions, with a certain ritual cleanliness. One should not have touched the dead body or corpse. One should have had a ritual cleansing. One should not have had discharges. One should not have all those bodily uncleanliness, impurities. When we read the book of Leviticus, we will see that. So maybe these two, Nadab and Abihu, violated that personal and personal cleanliness or purity, or they did not have the adequate inner disposition. It could also be in the rituals that they perform. Maybe there was some flaw or some mistake in the way they carried out the sacrifice. So the unworthy sacrifice could be referring to 3 dimensions or 3 areas or 3 aspects. Unworthiness in relationship to the sacrificing objects or animals which they brought. Unworthiness with regard to their personal disposition of the priests themselves, and unworthiness in the manner or in the rituals they carried out, the rituals they practiced. Well, even today, this incident of Nadab and Abihu should remain as a warning to any priest. And we know in the New Testament understanding, every believer is a priest, every Christian is a priest. Of course, there is the ministerial priesthood and the common priesthood. They are different. A priest, ordained priest, has a ministerial priesthood, but a baptized Christian has a common priesthood. Whether ministerial priesthood or common priesthood, all are priests. And when a believer who is a priest comes before God for offering or participating in sacrifice, one should take the required amount of care required attention so that one offers a worthy sacrifice. Of course, this responsibility, I cannot deny, is greatly falling on the ordained priest, the one who exercises the ministerial priesthood. Everybody has the responsibility, but obviously an ordained priest has a greater responsibility to make sure that every single time that he approaches the altar of sacrifice, one has to offer a worthy sacrifice. Of course, human beings as we are, there will be limitations, there will be weaknesses and so on. And God is, while a just God, is also a merciful God and will have kindness, mercy towards our human weaknesses and frailties and mistakes of that sort. But one should not take for granted. One should be very, very careful, both the ministerial priest and the common priest. So this particular passage, chapter 10 of the book of Leviticus is an important lesson in that regard. Now we come to chapter 11. Oh, well, chapter 11, if we have read that chapter, once again, a chapter which raises this doubt within us. What is the relevance of this chapter for us? Why do we ask this question? Because chapter 11 is a detailed list of a very long list of what is clean food and what is unclean food. When we say what is clean food and unclean food, please don't misunderstand. It is not in medical terms. In medical terms, or not specifically in hygienic term either. So the clean food and unclean food, the distinction is made not purely on the medical term level or on the hygiene level. But here the Bible is speaking about ritual cleanliness and ritual uncleanness. Ritually or cultically, some food is clean and some food is unclean. And then afterwards, there is a long list of unclean animals. Animals which cannot be eaten by the Hebrews because they are unclean. Now, all of us, by all means, will remember one animal or one food which is declared as unclean in Old Testament, and that is eating of pig or eating of pork is declared as unclean, and that is prohibited in the Old Testament. And in the book of Leviticus, we do find that eating of pig or eating of pork is prohibited. Now, we Christians do not follow that prohibition anymore. Of course, some people, because of their allergy or because they simply don't like that meat, they may not eat. But even those people who do not eat pork or pig, they don't eat it for cultic reason, for religious reason. They don't eat it either for hygienic reason or simply they don't like it. So we have no cultic or religious restriction on eating pork. Now, the reason we know, we all take it from the book, from the New Testament, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, and in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, very clearly, there is the teaching of the New Testament, teaching of Jesus, in which Jesus says, a man is not made defiled, or a person is not defiled by what one eats, but a person is defiled by what comes out of a person. So a person is not is made unclean not by what goes inside a person, but instead a person is made unclean by what comes out of a person, what comes out of the mouth of a person. And the Bible says it very clearly. With that, Jesus declared every food is a food, clean food. Every food can be eaten. Something similar we find in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, in that vision of Cornelius. And there the angel clearly tells Cornelius, what is declared clean by God, human beings should not declare unclean. And with that, every food is made clean or can be. So we, in the New Testament, follow that principle, where Jesus has abrogated the difference between clean and unclean food. So we don't have to follow this ritual principles found in the book of Leviticus. So that is very clear. But apart from that, I just want to bring to your attention one more small point. And what is that? That is, in spite of the fact that in the New Testament it is very, very clear that all food is declared as clean by God, edible by God, ritually and religiously they are clean. There is no prohibition. In spite of that clarity, there are still some people raise this question. Still some people question the practice of Christians eating pork, because they say in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, it is explicitly prohibited not to eat pig. Still, why do you eat pig? And there are certain religions, of course, Hebrews still hold on to this and they don't eat pig. And you also are aware there are other religions as well, which because it is prohibited in the Bible, they don't eat pig. And because they don't eat pork, they claim they are more faithful to the Old Testament than us Christians. They blame us being unfaithful to the Old Testament teachings. Now, what do I have to say about that argument? What I want you to see is the book of Leviticus, chapter 11. If you go through it, read it clearly, we notice that pig is not the only animal which is prohibited by God from eating to the Jews. I repeat, pig is not the only animal. There are almost 25, 26 individual animals being mentioned, and there are certain classes or groups of beings, animals or birds or types of fish which are prohibited from eating. So if you put together all of them, there are 25, 26 specific individual creatures which are prohibited to the Jews. God says you shall not eat them, and there are groups of animals, groups of birds, groups of sea creatures which are prohibited from eating. So one wonders, when there are almost hundreds of beings which are prohibited by God from eating, why do certain religions insist only on one animal and say that animal cannot be eaten? If one says or claims that they are being more faithful to the rules in the book of Leviticus than us Christians, then my response would be, well, if you actually claim you are more faithful to the book of Leviticus, you should not eat any of these creatures enlisted in that book of Leviticus. And you can't just keep away from one animal, pig, and say we are more faithful to the book of Leviticus and Christians are not. No, that is the hypocrisy. That is the duplicity. If you actually want to claim that you are more faithful to the book of Leviticus, you should not eat any of these animals or any of these birds or any of these sea creatures. And which are those? You notice in the book of Leviticus, you read long, long lists. So there is a kind of a double standard being practiced there. Of course, we are not saying much about it. I just want to bring that to your attention. And not only that, in the book of Leviticus, we will come across many other ritual practices, which many of the religions or most of the religions do not follow anymore. Still, they claim that they are more faithful to the book of Leviticus than the Christians. So they are taking an advantage over the ignorance of ours. When some people come and tell us we are more faithful to the book of Leviticus than you Christians, because we do not know what are all the rules and regulations enlisted in the book of Leviticus, and which these people also do not follow. Since we are not aware of it, we simply keep quiet and we gulp down. So therefore, read the book of Leviticus and see the umpteen number of ritual principles and regulations. Many of them are not followed by most of the modern people. And Jesus, we will speak about that maybe towards the end of the book of Leviticus. Jesus also do not expect expect that from us. But in this whole bargain, we should not forget there are certain moral principles which book of Leviticus highlights, and that we should hold on to. That there is absolutely no compromise. And they are the principles of justice and principles of love. And they are enumerated, they are specified how. Unfortunately, what happens is those people who insist on the ritual rules and regulations which book of Leviticus highlight, like not eating certain animals, washing the hand in a particular way, and washing the clothes in a specific way. So those people who insist so much on these rituals, they don't give equal importance to the law of justice and law of mercy or law of love. That's a contradiction. What we are instructed, what we are taught in the Christian faith or in the Christian revelation, inspired by the revelations of Jesus, is give more importance to the law of justice, law of mercy, and law of love. And the other ritual practices, some of them, not all of them, some of them were just relevant only for the time in which it was given, may not be relevant for us. So we must make a distinction between what is most important and what is of secondary importance. And you might ask a doubt, how do we know? What is the criterion? Criteria is only the teachings of Jesus. Look at the teachings of Jesus, and the teachings of Jesus will tell us which are most important and which are of secondary importance. And book of Leviticus, when we read, we need to read that and understand and appreciate that within the cultural, social, religious context of that time, and also relating that with the new revelations that have come to us with Jesus. Keep away Jesus and you can't properly understand the book of Leviticus. We have to understand the book of Leviticus, keeping it along with the teachings of Jesus, along with the revelations of Jesus. So that is with regard to chapter 11, and the same thing can be said about the following chapters as well, my dear brothers and sisters. For example, chapter 12. Chapter 12 once again gives certain ritual rules, and this time the rules are about the purification, and it is spoken here about the purification of a woman after childbirth. Once again, these are ritual purification rules which we are not required to follow after the New Testament revelations. However, it is good to know what the book of Leviticus is saying about the purification rule of a woman after the childbirth. It makes a distinction. The purification rules, there is one rule related to when a woman gives birth to a male child, and there is another rule slightly different related to when a woman gives birth to a female child. When a woman gives birth to a male child, according to the book of Leviticus, for 7 days, the woman would be ceremoniously unclean for 7 days. And on 8th day, the woman has to come to the temple, offer the child, and on 8th day, the circumcision will be performed, and the ceremonious uncleanliness will be removed for 7 days. But the woman will continue to have blood purification for another 33 days. 33 days. Including the 7 days of ceremonial uncleanliness. So altogether, a woman will be considered unclean for 33 days. 7 days ceremoniously unclean, and on the 8th day, they can offer the child to God and perform the circumcision and so on. And for 33 days, blood uncleanliness. So a woman has to go through the purification rites after the 33 days if the male child is born. Whereas book of Leviticus chapter 12 tells a slightly different rule concerning the female child. When a female child is born, a woman would be ceremoniously unclean for 2 weeks. Double the days, 14 days, 2 weeks. And the blood purification days are once again double, 66 days. Now, one may ask, why is this difference? Unfortunately, we will have to say here once again, we see that patriarchal thinking, the male domination of the society being expressed. Of course, in the original creation of human beings, according to the understanding of the Bible, genuinely, book of Genesis, there is equality between man and woman. They are both equal. They both have the nature of God, but at the same image of God. But at the same time, already when we spoke about that, we did say though the Bible is very clear about the equality between man and woman, the cultural elements of that time did have certain influence on the people of Israel. And the cultural context of that time influenced the people of Israel. And that influence is sometimes expressed in some of the biblical narrations. So here, this is one instance where the cultural influence on the people of Israel is expressed here in the biblical narration. A patriarchal society where there is a male domination, male being is considered a little superior to female being. So here, unfortunately, is an expression of that. But once again, I repeat, that is not the original intention of the divine word of God, the Bible. Of course, when it comes to the New Testament, Jesus will completely abrogate all that very explicitly and very clear. Now we come to chapter 13. Chapter 13 of the book of Leviticus, once again, is to be understood in the cultural, social, historical context of that time. Chapter 13 of the book of Leviticus gives us the rules and regulations concerning leprosy. And it speaks also, or it elaborates on the varieties and the symptoms of leprosy. Varieties of leprosy, symptoms of leprosy. Continuation of that is found in chapter 14. And chapter 14 speaks about the purification of lepers and leprous houses which were contaminated by leprosy. So chapter 13 and chapter 14 gives us a fairly good idea about how the Israelites dealt with the leprosy and the lepers, how the purification was carried out, and so on. Just one clarification I want to offer you, my dear brothers and sisters. When the book of Leviticus in this context speak about leprosy, it is not merely referring to the typical disease called leprosy, which we will consider today as very, very serious. Of course, with our vaccines and so on, now leprosy almost is eradicated from the major face of the earth. Maybe there are certain areas still leprosy is found, but there are treatment for it. So leprosy is no more so dangerous and so fearsome today. But in the ancient time, leprosy was such a fearsome sickness because leprosy had no effective healing or medicine. And not only that, leprosy was contagious so fast. So therefore, the ancient people were so frightened of leprosy. And all these rules and regulations regarding leprosy is to be understood in the background of such a fearsome context or atmosphere. The clarification that I want to say is the Old Testament people considered called leprosy not only those serious diseases called leprosy, but anything that is similar to leprosy. For example, a white patch to appear on the skin. Old Testament people would call that as a leprosy. Similarly, sometimes the unremovable fungus appearing on clothes or on the walls of the houses, that also they would give this general title as leprosy. So just a clarification I want to offer to you is, maybe most of you know it already. However, I repeat, leprosy was a general term. Leprosy was a general term used in the Old Testament to refer to any type of sin-related sicknesses. Leprosy was a general term used in the Old Testament to refer to any type of or any kind of skin-related sicknesses. And it was not only used to refer to the skin-related sicknesses, it was also used to refer to certain realities that affect clothes or walls or furnitures and so on. The unremovable fungus that comes on this kind of things so also were called as leprosy. And of course, in the social context of that time, sociological context of that time, this was a very, very serious situation because they did not know how to control, how to curtail, and they did not have a effective remedy for it. So therefore, they considered it very serious, and all this was. Once again, we relate that with the New Testament. When it comes to the New Testament, Jesus did not anymore go by these rules and regulations. He touched the lepers, He healed the lepers. He received the lepers into his fold and so on. So the understanding about leprosy and so on totally changes when it comes to the New Testament. And we Christians go by the teachings of Jesus and the new revelations that have come in the New Testament, while not forgetting the importance, the relevance, and the meaning of these rules and regulations as they are found in the book of Leviticus. With that, we come to chapter 15. Chapter 15, once again, is certain rules and regulations about the discharges from the human body. We know that discharges from the human body and how that would make a man unclean or a person unclean, and how one should go through ritual cleansing, a particular ritualistic kind of washing which is required to make a person return to the cleanliness after the human bodily discharges. Once again, these are all cultic, ritualistic rules and regulations. And then we have got chapter 16 of the book of Leviticus. Chapter 16, the book of Leviticus, is narrating to us the rituals performed on the Day of Atonement. Day of Atonement, a very, very important religious day for the people of Israel. I repeat, we have said that a few times already. However, I repeat, Day of Atonement is the annual day in which all the people of Israel were supposed to be gathered in the presence of God, and their sins are forgiven. And for that, they have got certain rituals to be performed. Sacrificial animal has to be first brought and sacrificed for the sake of the sins of the priest and priestly family first. And then 2 lambs or 2 goats are to be brought. One goat is to be sacrificed for the in order to remove the sins of the people in at large, the people as a whole, and the other goat, the other lamb, over which the priest will lay the hands, symbolizing that the sin of the entire nation is laid on the animal, and afterwards it is left loose to the desert. The animal carrying the sin, burden of sin, will go to the desert, and there it will be let loose. And that lamb is called as the lamb or the goat for Azazel. Well, Azazel simply means a scapegoat. Scapegoat, a goat that carries the sin of the rest of the nation. Now, we also know this becomes a symbol for Jesus Christ himself. Jesus becomes the sacrificial animal of the Day of Atonement, who brings about a reconciliation between us, the sinners, and God, the Holy God. And Jesus becomes the scapegoat who carries on his shoulder the entire weight of the sin of the human race. So chapter 16, that way, is an anticipation, is a symbolic anticipation of the effect of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus himself. So that is with regard to chapter 16. And then we come to chapter 17, the slaughtering of animals and so on. But since the time is up today, I think we should conclude the class for today. So therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, thank you very much for listening to me and showing this interest to study the Word of God. I conclude for today. We will meet once again, if God wills permits, next week.